The night Jack Walker opened his cabin door into the howling Montana blizzard, he had no idea he was about to save the last pieces of a young man's love, and the only reason a forgotten storm legend would return 8 years later. What he found in that abandoned shack should have never survived. A starving German shepherd chained to a post, 3 newborn puppies freezing against her ribs, and tracks in the snow that ended in the middle of nowhere. But the truth behind those tracks would break even a Navy SEAL. Jack's decision that night didn't just save a family of dogs. It set off a chain of events that would pull a lost teenage girl into his life, turn a tiny puppy into the greatest rescue dog in the county, and bring a dying hero back into the snow one final time to save a neighbor against impossible odds. If you want to know how this circle of love, sacrifice, and destiny comes full circle, stay with me. And please follow the channel, comment where you're watching from, or just say amen for these incredible souls. The story begins now. The wind hammered against the cabin walls like a fist desperate to get in, rattling the old windows and sending icy drafts through every crack in the timber. Jack Walker paused in the middle of his living room, listening. He was 66 now, tall but slightly stooped from years of parachute jumps, forced marches, and the kind of battles the government never admitted happened. His hair, once black as rifle steel, was now a thick gray that curled over the collar of his flannel shirt. A full beard, rough and silvered, covered a face carved by weather, war, and time. Most people in Snow Ridge found Jack intimidating, but those who had served beside him knew the truth. Behind those cold blue eyes lived a man who carried far too many ghosts. The storm outside reminded him of one of those ghosts. A night in Afghanistan, when a dust tempest swallowed 2 members of his unit. He pushed the memory away. Storms were just storms until they weren't. He looked toward the braided rug near the wood stove, expecting to see Ranger curled there. Ranger was a one-eyed orange tabby, 12 years old, small-boned and feisty despite age. His missing eye, a milky scarred socket, came from a fox trap he'd wandered into years ago, and since then he'd been deeply attached to Jack, shadowing him through the cabin with a swagger only cats and old soldiers possessed. Tonight, though, the rug was empty. A cold spike of fear stabbed Jack's chest. "Ranger!" he called, his voice hoarse from disuse. Silence answered. He checked every corner of the small cabin, under the rocking chair, behind the firewood rack, even on top of the pantry shelves where Ranger sometimes perched like a judgmental gargoyle. Nothing. Then he noticed the mudroom door. It was closed, but the iron latch wasn't seated fully. The violent wind must have shaken it loose just enough for a curious old cat to nose it open. A thin ribbon of snow snuck through the crack and lay on the floorboards like spilled salt. "Damn it," Jack muttered. Ranger hated the cold. A cat his age wouldn't last long in a blizzard like this, not with the temperature dropping below 20 below. Jack's pulse quickened, the familiar pinch of adrenaline sharpening his senses. It had been years since he'd had to move with urgency, but old training never truly left a SEAL. He grabbed his heavy wool coat, the one lined with sheepskin that smelled faintly of smoke. His boots, army surplus, scarred and nearly as old as he was, slipped onto his feet easily. He tugged a knit cap over his hair, snatched a battery lantern from the hook, and pushed outside. The storm hit like a wall. Wind slammed into him, freezing the moisture in his beard instantly. Snow swirled in a white chaos so dense he could barely see more than a few feet ahead. But he set his jaw, strong, angular, stubborn, and forced himself down the porch steps, lantern cutting a weak cone through the storm. Where would Ranger go? Not far. The cat always sought shelter. Barns, sheds, hollow logs. Jack struggled forward, following what he thought were faint indentations in the snow, though they blurred nearly as fast as he spotted them. Every breath burned like ice shards in his lungs. He trudged toward the tree line, half by memory, half by instinct. 50 yards from the cabin stood an old hunting shack. When Jack bought the land decades ago, the structure had already been sagging. He'd never bothered to tear it down. Tonight it loomed like a dark shape swallowed by snow, leaning to one side under the weight of the storm. Jack waded through thigh-deep drifts, muscles screaming. As he neared the shack, the lantern caught a sliver of movement, a flash of orange. "Ranger!" He squeezed through the crooked doorway, boots crunching on frozen dirt. The cat was huddled under a broken workbench, his frail body trembling so hard his fur quivered like a leaf. He let out a weak, wheezing meow when he saw Jack. Jack dropped to one knee, scooped Ranger into his coat, and zipped it halfway so the old tabby could press against his chest for warmth. "Got you, buddy," Jack murmured, relief loosening his shoulders. Then he heard it. A metallic scrape. Slow. Heavy. Like iron dragged across stone. Jack froze. At first he thought it was the wind bullying the sagging roof, but the sound came again. Closer. Deliberate. He lifted the lantern. The beam sliced across rotting timbers, piles of debris, collapsed shelves, then fell on something that made his blood run colder than the storm. Eyes. 2 eyes glinting in the darkness. Wide, terrified, and burning with a mixture of warning and desperation. A German shepherd lay half-collapsed against a support post, her ribs visible beneath matted fur. The chain around her neck was thick, industrial, digging deep into raw flesh that oozed with infection. Her body was little more than skin and bone, but she still curled herself protectively around 3 newborn puppies, each no bigger than a man's palm, mewling faintly as they sought warmth from her failing body. "Jesus," Jack whispered. He had seen cruelty in the world, both natural and man-made, but something about the scene punched through even his hardened exterior. Someone had chained her here. Someone had left her to die. The shepherd bared her teeth weakly, not in aggression, but in fear. Her eyes begged him to leave her alone, yet begged for help all at once. Jack backed up slowly, whispering, "Easy, girl, easy." Then he made the only decision a man like him could make. He tightened his hold on Ranger, turned toward the door, and said, "I'll come back." The race home was a blur of snow and pain. By the time he burst back into the cabin, he was winded, trembling, and half-numb. Ranger shot straight to the stove, collapsing in a shuddering heap. Jack didn't stop to warm himself. He moved with military efficiency, grabbing bolt cutters, a wool blanket, lengths of rope, and finally, his old utility sled he used for hauling firewood. Minutes later, he was back in the storm. The sled dragged behind him, catching on hidden roots and buried rocks. His breath came in harsh, ragged bursts as he reached the shack again. This time the shepherd didn't growl. Her eyes tracked him with weary resignation. Jack cut the chain, metal snapping with a gunshot crack, then gently lifted her. She was horrifyingly light for a dog her size. He wrapped her in the wool blanket, tucking it close. The puppies were next, 3 tiny scrap-sized creatures already cooling. Jack stripped off his coat, teeth chattering violently, and placed the pups inside the fleece lining. He wrapped the coat around them, tying the sleeves around his neck like a makeshift sling so they stayed against his chest. cold, knifed through his flannel shirt instantly. "Let's go home," he muttered. The trek back felt endless. Snow swallowed his legs to the knee. Wind howled like a banshee. The sled weighed twice what it should have. The cold stole strength from his arms first, then his back, then his legs. More than once he stumbled and nearly stayed down, but the faint movement of the puppies against his chest kept him upright. So did the thought of the shepherd's hollow eyes. When the cabin finally emerged from the whiteout, Jack felt a surge of something wild and desperate. He climbed the steps, shoved the door open with his shoulder, and dragged the sled inside. The warmth hit him like fire, burning his frozen skin. He collapsed to his knees beside the sled. The shepherd lifted her head weakly, meeting his eyes with a silent plea. "We made it," Jack whispered, voice raw. "All of us." The cabin filled with a heavy silence that clung to the air like frost on window panes. Jack laid the German shepherd on a pile of old wool blankets near the stove, her breath shallow and uneven, the rise and fall of her chest barely perceptible. Her fur, thick but ungroomed, was matted with ice, dirt, and blood. Up close she looked even worse, ribs sharp as broken boards, paws cracked and bleeding, eyes clouded yet still searching the room, as if expecting someone who wasn't there. Jack guessed she was around 4 or 5 years old, a full-grown shepherd in her prime if she'd ever had the chance to live a normal life. The puppies lay in a basket lined with towels that Jack had warmed in the dryer. 3 tiny bodies pressed together, squeaking softly, their stomachs rising in uneven little jerks. Ranger, who usually acted offended by the presence of anything new in the house, surprisingly walked over, sniffed the pups once, and curled near the basket with a soft, protective purr. Jack shook his head. "Traitor," he muttered affectionately to the cat. But his focus snapped back to the German shepherd. Her breath hitched. Her eyes rolled slightly. Her heartbeat, when Jack placed a trembling hand against her ribs, felt irregular, rapid, then slowing abruptly. He recognized the signs instantly. He'd seen men crash into shock on the battlefield. "Stay with me, girl," he whispered. Then his training took the wheel. He moved with a precision he hadn't used in years, spreading antiseptic over the deep wound where the chain had eaten into her flesh. He cut away crusted fur, flushed the area with warm saline he improvised from bottled water and table salt, dried it, packed gauze, taped it all while whispering calm, steadying words. He monitored her breathing, adjusted blankets, massaged her limbs to keep circulation moving. The cabin transformed into a field hospital, each action muscle memory from missions long past. But with every soft whimper from the dog, another memory clawed its way to the surface. Nights in the desert, a medic screaming for a tourniquet, someone calling Jack's name. Then silence. The German shepherd shifted, letting out a long, low groan, and Jack flinched hard enough that the lantern on the table rattled. Not now, he told himself, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles whitened. Not tonight. He returned to the dog, breathing slow, forcing the PTSD back into the dark where it belonged. By dawn, the storm had calmed, but the world outside was buried in white. Jack barely noticed. He sat against the stove, the shepherd's head resting near his thigh. She was alive, but only barely. A fist pounded on the door. Jack blinked awake, stiff and exhausted. "Jack? You in there?" The voice was deep, gravelly, unmistakably familiar. Jack opened the door to reveal Sheriff Ben Collins, snow-dusted and broad-shouldered, wearing a brown sheriff's coat lined with fur. Ben was in his late 50s, with the kind of face that looked carved out of old wood. Square jaw, heavy brow, thick dark hair just starting to gray at the temples. A neatly trimmed mustache sat above a perpetually serious mouth. Ben wasn't a man prone to smiles unless he trusted you. Jack had known him for almost 15 years. They hunted together in the fall, drank beer on bad nights, and understood each other without many words. Ben stepped inside, stomping off the snow. "You all right? Storm knocked half the county offline. Figured I'd check on you." Jack nodded toward the blankets on the floor. "Found her in the hunting shack." Ben knelt, his eyes softening. "Good Lord." He scanned the wound, the protruding ribs, the barely there breaths. "Somebody did this?" "She was chained there. 3 pups, too." Ben sat back on his heels, shaking his head, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He was a man shaped by years of dealing with the worst folks in the county. Drug cases, neglect, domestic violence. And though he rarely showed emotion, cruelty toward animals always hit him hardest. "You think they dumped her?" Ben asked. Jack hesitated. "Dunno. Storm wiped out tracks, but we need to check the shack." Ben nodded once. "Get your coat." The hunting shack was swallowed by snowdrifts when they reached it, but the interior told a clearer story in daylight. Jack held the lantern while Ben inspected the ground. The chain was still there, its broken end jagged from where Jack had cut it. Frost-coated old cans, discarded rope, a filthy blanket. "Looks like she's been here for days," Ben muttered. "Maybe more." Jack scanned the shadows and spotted something half buried behind a broken chair. "There." He knelt and pulled out a tattered backpack, the fabric frayed, one strap ripped off. Inside were only a few items: a torn jacket, a crushed water bottle, a handful of protein bar wrappers, and a crumpled gas station receipt. Jack smoothed it open with gloved fingers. "Last week," he murmured. "Cash. 1 bag of dog kibble." Ben exhaled slowly. So someone cared enough to buy food, but left her chained? Jack didn't answer. Something about it didn't feel right. He reached deeper into the pack and found a leather dog collar, the buckle snapped clean through. Attached to it was a brass nameplate, scratched but still readable. Scout. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. "Scout," he said aloud. The name carried a weight, a familiarity, an identity. It wasn't the name of a stray. Someone had loved this dog. Ben stood. "We should look around the perimeter." They circled the shack, and 50 yards away, Ben stopped abruptly. "Jack, here." A shape lay in the snow, partially buried by drifts. The body of a young man, barely more than a boy, his blonde hair stiff with ice, his skin pale blue. He wore a thin jacket, torn pants, one boot missing. His ankle was swollen, grotesquely, twisted wrong. "Poor kid," Ben muttered quietly. "Doesn't look like he had a chance." Jack crouched beside the body. In the kid's hand was a frozen cell phone, the battery dead. Ben passed him an evidence bag. They brought the phone back to the cabin. While Jack tended the shepherd, who stirred weakly when he whispered "Scout," Ben plugged the phone into Jack's generator-powered outlet. Minutes later, the screen lit up. A lock-screen photo appeared. The young man smiling brightly, cheeks flushed with life, one arm around a healthy, radiant German shepherd. Scout. Jack swallowed hard. Ben opened the Messages app. The most recent draft glowed at the top. My name is Evan Brooks. I broke my ankle. Storm getting worse. Scouts chained so she won't follow me. Trying to get signal. Please send help. Save her. It was unsent. Evan hadn't made it far enough for the phone to connect. Jack's breath hitched. The boy hadn't abandoned Scout. He'd chained her to keep her from dying next to him. He'd spent his last money on food for her. He'd crawled through a blizzard on a broken leg, trying to bring help. Ben lowered his head. He died trying to save her. Jack looked at Scout lying near the stove, her eyes fluttering open at the sound of her name. Somewhere inside them, he saw grief. Recognition. A dog waiting for footsteps that would never return. We'll make sure she's safe, Jack whispered. I swear it. The days that followed were unlike anything Jack Walker had experienced in years. Loud, chaotic, unpredictable, and strangely full of purpose. Scout, though still recovering, proved to be a fiercely devoted mother. With food in her belly, clean bandages around her neck, and warmth surrounding her, she slowly regained strength. Within a week, the hollowed look in her eyes softened. Her ribs, once stark beneath her skin, began to hide beneath a new layer of muscle. Most importantly, she no longer watched the door with that agonizing mix of hope and dread. Instead, she watched her puppies. The 3 newborns, who had been little more than shivering bundles the night Jack found them, now squeaked with energy. One had a splash of white across his muzzle. Another was entirely fawn-colored. The smallest had a black patch drifting over one eye. Jack hadn't planned on naming them, but every creature deserved an identity, and so they slowly earned their names through the small traits he observed. Brave, the largest, was fearless, crawling first toward anything new. Hope, the smallest, often curled into Jack's beard whenever he picked her up. And Grace, steady, observant Grace, had a seriousness in her tiny gaze that reminded him of Scout herself. Ranger continued to surprise him. The old orange tabby behaved as if the puppies were his recruits. He watched them from atop the woodpile, scolded them with low meows when they wandered too far, and even curled around them for warmth when Scout needed a break. Jack found himself muttering, "You're softer than I thought," every time Ranger refused to move from his post. By the 6th morning, Jack heard the unmistakable sound of a truck pulling into his driveway. He recognized the engine immediately. It was Dr. Miranda Lee's old Suburban, the one she'd driven since the early 2000s. Miranda was the only veterinarian for 20 miles in any direction, and she treated the county's animals with the same intensity a battlefield medic treated wounded soldiers. When she stepped out into the snow, the cold air carried her sharp lavender scent. Miranda was in her early 60s, petite but sturdy, the kind of woman built from a lifetime of practical work and long nights. Her black hair, streaked with silver, was tied in a tight bun at the nape of her neck, and her almond-shaped eyes were keen, thoughtful, and often disapproving in the way only someone who deeply cared could be. She carried 2 heavy bags of supplies, her movements efficient. Behind her climbed out a girl, thin, pale-skinned, bundled in a jacket that looked a size too large. She had long dark hair tucked into a wool beanie, sharp cheekbones, and cautious brown eyes that darted around like a skittish deer. Jack recognized her from town. "This is Mia Rodriguez," Miranda said before Jack asked. "She works part-time at the clinic. Smart kid. Bit rough around the edges." Mia's expression revealed she'd heard the comment. She shot Miranda a brief glare before turning away, hands stuffed deep into her pockets. Jack observed her with a soldier's quiet intuition. She was 17, maybe 18, tall and narrow, with the posture of someone who'd learned not to take up too much space. Her skin was olive-toned, her lips a tight line. She moved with careful, defensive steps, a product of too many childhood transitions. Jack knew that posture. It was the stance of someone who'd been passed from home to home and had taught herself not to trust stability. Inside the cabin, the moment Scout lifted her head, Mia's gaze shifted dramatically. The dog was lying near the stove, her 3 puppies pawing at her belly. Mia knelt beside them almost without thinking, one hand reaching tentatively toward Grace, who immediately pressed her nose against Mia's finger. Jack noticed the change instantly. Mia's shoulders softened, her eyes widened, her breath hitched in a way that betrayed emotion she'd kept buried. Scout watched this girl with a calm, almost knowing expression, exhaling a low rumble that sounded like approval. Miranda raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'll be damned. Scout doesn't warm up to most people." Mia didn't respond. She was busy letting Grace climb into her lap. The puppy's tiny paws kneaded at her jacket, her tail flicking back and forth as she yawned. The girl who'd walked in like a coiled spring now sat cross-legged on Jack's floor, fully disarmed. Jack pretended not to notice, but something in him recognized a truth. Some souls, man, dog, or otherwise, found each other because they needed to. Miranda spent the next hour giving Scout a thorough examination. She checked the wound, replaced the bandages, took the mother's temperature, and inspected each of the puppies. Jack watched her work silently. Miranda had always been this way, focused, meticulous, and calm. She was one of the few people who treated Jack not like a broken veteran, but like a regular man who happened to live alone. He had always appreciated that. After finishing, Miranda stood up. "Good news. She's healing beautifully. A few weeks of antibiotics and she'll be herself again." She glanced at the pups, then at Jack. "What's your plan for these troublemakers?" Jack folded his arms. "Find homes. Good ones." Miranda smirked. "People will line up. The whole county's heard the story already." Mia looked up sharply. "What story?" "Jack dragging a half-dead dog and 3 pups through a blizzard," Miranda said proudly. "Even made the sheriff tear up a little." Jack cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the praise. "Sheriff's soft when it comes to animals." Miranda ignored him and turned to Mia. "If you want, you can help this weekend. Good for your community service hours." Mia muttered something that sounded like, "Yeah, okay," but Grace refused to be put down. When Jack gently tried to reclaim the puppy, Grace whined, wiggled, and burrowed deeper into Mia's arms. Miranda laughed. "Looks like you've been chosen." Mia rolled her eyes but didn't hide the tiny smile tugging her mouth. Later that week, the adoptive families began to appear. A soft-spoken widow named Helen Marsh, about 60, with short gray hair and kind hazel eyes, arrived first. She lived alone, her hands trembling slightly from arthritis. When she held Hope, the smallest puppy curled instantly against her chest. Helen began crying quietly, whispering, "I haven't felt a heartbeat this small since my daughter was a baby." Hope was hers by the time she left. Then came the Bakers, a young family with 2 energetic sons. The father, Matt Baker, was a tall man in his 30s with sandy hair and a gentle demeanor. His wife, Claire, had warm brown eyes and a booming laugh that filled the cabin with life. Brave bounded toward the boys immediately, tackling them with uncoordinated licks. It was clear he belonged with them. Grace, however, sat stubbornly beside Mia, refusing all other hands. Every time someone tried to pick her up, she retreated back to the teenager's side. Jack made the decision for all of them. Grace stays here, with Mia and me. We'll train her properly. Mia blinked in surprise, unsure whether to argue or accept. But when Grace nudged her cheek with a soft yip, she whispered, "Okay." Jack said nothing, but a quiet satisfaction threaded through him. By evening, only Scout, Grace, Ranger, and Mia remained in the cabin. It felt right. Mia knelt to scratch Grace behind the ears. "Guess we're stuck together, huh?" she murmured. Jack glanced at Scout, who lay watching them with gentle pride. "Storm brought them here," he said softly. "Maybe it brought you too." Mia looked away, blinking quickly. "Maybe." Jack didn't push. Some healing needed time, just like Scout's. 8 winters carved themselves into the mountains around Snow Ridge, and the world within Jack Walker's cabin changed with them. The lines on Jack's face deepened, his once unyielding posture softened, and the hair beneath his knit cap turned almost completely white. At 74, he was still sturdy for a man his age, tall with a wide chest and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime pushing his body past its breaking point. But the years had taken their toll. His right knee ached in storms, his shoulders stiffened in the mornings, and most of all, his hearing had faded. Sounds came slower now, muffled around the edges, and sometimes he simply missed them altogether. Yet he never missed the sound of Scout. Her presence, even when silent, filled every space of his life. The aging German shepherd still moved with dignity, though her steps were more deliberate, her once swift gait now careful and measured. Her coat, once thick and gleaming, had faded into a soft silver white, especially around her muzzle and spine. Her eyes, though clouded with age, carried a wisdom Jack never stopped marveling at. She had seen grief, storms, loss, and yet she stayed, always within reach, always watching him with the quiet loyalty that no human could ever match. Ranger, old as time itself, had grown slower too. The orange tabby spent most of his days sunning himself in the window or curled on the back of Jack's recliner. He was thinner, his remaining eye hazier, but he still made it his mission to sit beside Scout every night, as if refusing to let his old comrade face the dark alone. Jack often joked that the two senior animals understood each other better than they understood him, and Mia, little guarded 17-year-old Mia, was no longer a child trying to hide her pain under oversized jackets. At 25, she had grown into a striking young woman with long dark hair she now kept tied in a low ponytail, sharp brown eyes that no longer darted away in fear, and a confidence built from years of training and proving herself. She stood taller, shoulders squared, voice steady. She wore the uniform of a K-9 search and rescue technician, navy jacket, reflective strips, badge on the sleeve, with pride and purpose. Grace, the puppy who once fit in the palm of Jack's hand, had grown into a magnificent German shepherd, powerful, sleek, amber-eyed, with a black saddle marking and impeccable instincts. She was known across 3 counties now. The miracle dog, people called her. The dog who could track through storms, read the land like a map, and find the lost when hope seemed gone. Jack liked to brag that she got her stubborn streak from him. Mia insisted Grace got her smarts from Scout. In truth, both were right. One evening in late January, a blizzard swept down from the Canadian border, swallowing Snow Ridge in white. The storm was fierce, not as deadly as the one 8 years ago, but strong enough to shut down highways and knock out power. As the sun vanished behind a curtain of snow, Jack lit lanterns around the cabin and warmed a pot of stew on the wood stove. Scout lay beside him, her head resting on his boot, breathing slow and deep. Grace stretched lazily on the rug, waiting for Mia, who was due to stop by after finishing her shift at the rescue unit. But the quiet didn't last. A rapid knock rattled the cabin door. Jack straightened, wincing as his knee popped. Scout rose too, though slower, her ears lifting. Grace was already at the door, tail stiff, posture alert. Jack opened it to find Sheriff Ben Collins, bundled in a heavy parka, snow frosting his dark mustache and eyebrows. Even at 60, Ben was imposing, tall, rugged, with deep-set eyes that rarely missed trouble. Tonight they were narrowed with urgency. "We've got a problem," Ben said, brushing snow off his shoulders. "Eli Turner is missing." Jack stiffened. Eli Turner was Jack's neighbor, a widowed man in his late 60s, thin as a fence post, with thinning gray hair and pale freckles. Eli was forgetful, gentle, and known for wandering farther than he should. "When?" Jack asked. "Couple hours ago. His daughter called when he didn't come home from checking his generator. We found tracks heading toward the ridge, but they vanished under the new snowfall. Mia's already geared up. Says she needs Grace." Grace was already pacing, whining under her breath. Scout stood too, slow but determined. Jack placed a gentle hand on her back. "No, girl. Not this time. It's too cold." But Scout looked him dead in the eyes and stepped forward. Her old legs trembled, but her resolve burned brighter than youth. "I think she wants to go," Ben said softly. Jack swallowed. Scout was 15 now, ancient for a shepherd. The storm would be brutal on her joints, her lungs, her bones. But she had earned the right to choose her last battles. "All right," Jack whispered, "but you stay close to me." They set off into the blizzard, Mia leading with Grace, the sheriff following with radio gear, and Jack walking carefully beside Scout. The snow whipped at their faces, and the world narrowed to the beams of their headlamps and the crunch of boots breaking through crusted drifts. Grace lowered her nose to the ground, avoiding the worst of the wind as she searched for Eli's scent. She began to pull left, then right, then forward, uncertain. The storm had smeared everything. "Easy, girl," Mia murmured. "Take your time." Scout, who had been trailing behind Jack, suddenly stopped. Her ears, still sharp despite age, twitched. She raised her head toward the ridge, nostrils flaring. Then she let out a single, raspy bark. Grace froze. Mia turned. Jack felt his heart jolt. Scout barked again, weak but insistent, and stepped toward a narrow ravine half hidden by snowdrifts. Ben lifted his headlamp. "Over there!" They rushed toward the edge, digging through the drift with gloved hands. Moments later, Grace let out a sharp howl. Beneath the snow lay Eli Turner, curled in a shallow depression, conscious but fading, his breath thin, his skin dangerously cold. "He's alive!" Mia shouted. Scout sank beside Jack, body trembling with exhaustion. Jack knelt next to her, brushing a hand down her silvered fur. "You did it," he whispered. "You found him." The rescue team carried Eli out on a stretcher. Grace stayed close to Mia, tail high with pride. Scout walked only a few steps before her legs began to shake again. Jack lifted her gently, cradling her like he had the night he first carried her from the shack. When they returned to town, people gathered at the sheriff's office, whispering in awe. They had seen Grace's miracles before, but tonight, the story belonged to Scout. Snow Ridge hadn't forgotten the dog from the blizzard 8 years ago. Now they would remember her twice over. Jack placed Scout beside the stove when they got home. She lay her head on his foot again, sighing deeply. He stroked her ear. "You saved another life," he murmured. "Still on duty after all these years." Scout closed her eyes, pressing her warm, aging body against his boot. She had become his ears, and he had become her voice. They needed each other more than ever. Winter returned to Snow Ridge with a softer touch than years before, as if the mountains themselves understood that this season would carry a different kind of weight. The first snow was gentle, powder drifting lazily across the evergreens and settling over the cabin roof like a white quilt. Inside, the fire crackled low, throwing warm orange light over the old wood floors, the worn armchair, and the two aging figures resting side by side. Scout lay on her blanket near the hearth, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Jack Walker sat beside her on the floor, one hand wrapped around her paw, thumb tracing small circles over her thinning fur. Scout was nearly 16 now, her silver coat soft as ash and her muzzle completely white. Her once strong legs had weakened. Her movements were slow and tender, as if she understood each step had to be saved for something meaningful. Her eyes, still bright, still knowing, followed Jack with a quiet trust that cut straight through him. He felt the truth in those eyes. They both knew the road ahead was shortening. Jack, older and more worn than the winter before, leaned forward. His hair was fully white now, falling over his forehead when he bent toward Scout. His beard was trimmed but patchy, his skin weathered like old leather. The lines around his eyes dug deeper each year, and his hearing had faded to the point where he relied on Scout to notice half the world for him. Now, though, Scout no longer rose when the kettle whistled or when footsteps approached. Jack felt the silence closing in. Ranger, the ancient tabby, curled on the armchair behind them, breathing with a faint wheeze. Even he seemed to understand that the cabin had shifted into a sacred kind of stillness. Jack talked softly to Scout, voice low and gentle. "You remember Evan, girl?" he whispered. "You remember that picture of him holding you? He loved you something fierce." Scout blinked slowly, as if listening. Jack swallowed the ache in his throat. He told her about Hope, living happily with Helen Marsh, who lovingly carried the small dog everywhere in her garden. He told her about Brave, now a sturdy protector of the Baker boys, famous for catching baseballs mid-air. And he told her about Grace, who slept each night beside Mia's bed and had become a legend of the search and rescue team. Scout shifted her head, nudging Jack's palm with her nose. Her breaths came slower, deeper. Jack leaned down, pressing his forehead gently to hers. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You made sure they had a life." His voice cracked. "You made sure I had one too." Hours passed like drifting snow. The fire dimmed to embers. Jack never moved. He stayed there, holding her paw, feeling the warmth fade as the night slipped quietly over the mountains. In the deepest part of the night, Scout exhaled one long, soft breath and did not draw another. Her body relaxed, her eyes closed. And in that moment, the cabin felt both heartbreakingly empty and quietly blessed. Jack lowered his head to her chest, his shoulders trembling. No tears came at first, just a heavy silence that filled the room like fog. It was only when Ranger climbed down and pressed his thin body against Scout's still form that the dam broke. Jack cried openly, gripping her paw the way he had held the hands of fallen brothers so many years ago. Morning found Snow Ridge blanketed in white, the sky pale blue, the air frozen crisp. Mia arrived first, her hair dusted with snow, her cheeks red from the cold. When she saw Scout lying still near the hearth, she sank to her knees beside Jack, her face folding into grief. She wrapped her arms around him without saying a word. They stayed like that until the sheriff's truck pulled up. Sheriff Ben Collins, sturdy and solemn as always, entered the cabin with his hat pressed to his chest. His mustache drooped more than usual, his eyes shadowed by sadness. He helped Jack carry Scout to the sled outside. The dog lay wrapped in the wool blanket she had slept on for years. Ranger followed them to the doorway, but did not step into the snow. Jack led the small procession up the hill behind his cabin, to the old oak tree overlooking the valley. Evan Brooks rested there, his ashes placed under a wooden marker that Jack had carved himself, simple and honest. Together with Ben, he dug a fresh patch of earth beside Evan's marker. Mia stood nearby, holding Grace's collar against her chest, tears slipping onto her gloves. They lowered Scout gently into the ground. Jack placed her repaired leather collar over her blanket, the brass nameplate shining faintly in the cold sunlight. Scout. When the last shovel of earth was smoothed over, the three of them stood in silence. Jack with his head bowed, Ben with his hat held to his heart, Mia wiping her cheeks. Grace, sensing the gravity, sat quietly at Mia's heel. The wind whispered through the branches of the old oak, carrying the feeling that two souls, one young, one old, had finally been reunited. Days passed, then weeks, and the cabin, once filled with the movement of paws and the steady presence of Scout, felt unbearably hollow. Jack wandered through rooms where echoes used to live. The rug Scout slept on lay untouched. The food bowls sat stacked near the stove. Ranger, too quiet for comfort, slept longer each day. Jack felt himself slipping, not toward despair, but toward a kind of stillness that frightened him. Scout had been his anchor for nearly a decade. Without her, he drifted. One gray afternoon, he drove into town. Snow Ridge's small animal rescue shelter sat behind the fire station, an old red building with peeling white trim. Inside, the scent of disinfectant mixed with hay filled the warm air. A woman named Marcy Dalton, a volunteer in her early 40s with curly blonde hair and round brown glasses, greeted Jack with a soft smile. Marcy was gentle-faced, slightly plump, her rosy cheeks always a little flushed from spending hours cleaning kennels. She had a warm, motherly presence and the habit of talking to animals as if they were children. "Looking for a dog?" she asked kindly. Jack hesitated, shoving his hands deep into his coat pockets. "Just looking." Marcy led him down the aisle. Puppies yipped eagerly. Younger dogs jumped against their gates. But Jack walked past all of them. His heart wasn't ready for youth, for chaos, for the energy of beginnings. Then he saw him. A large German Shepherd mix lay quietly in the last kennel. His coat was a deep rust brown with black streaks along his back. One ear stood straight up while the other flopped to the side. His eyes, warm amber, soft around the edges, held a timid sadness, the kind seen in animals who had lost more than one home. "That's Duke," Marcy said softly. "He's 10. Family surrendered him when they moved. Old boy doesn't understand why he's here." Jack crouched slowly. Duke lifted his head, uncertain at first, then shuffled forward until his nose touched Jack's hand. His body trembled, not from fear, but from hope. Jack felt the tremble echo inside his own chest. "I'll take him," he said. No hesitation, no second thought. When they stepped outside, Duke walked at Jack's side, matching his slow steps as if they'd trained together for years. Snowfall drifted around them. Duke looked up at him once, ears tilting softly, and Jack reached down to rest a hand on the dog's back. "Come on, partner," Jack murmured. "Let's go home." They walked up the snowy path toward the cabin, two aging souls, shadows stretching across the white ground, moving together toward whatever time they had left.